joining us. My name is Harriet Kendall. I'm the Associate Director for Administration in Residence Life. And I'm going to let Laura introduce herself.
Hi, I'm Laura Smith. I'm the Assignments and Occupancy Coordinator here with Residence Life.
So today we are here to talk about the housing application and the contract for room selection for 2022. We're going to go through a lot of slides and a lot of information. Don't worry, you don't have to retain it all. It's also all going to be posted online, shared with you again in other ways. And there is going to be time at the end for you to ask questions. And so we will get to all the questions at the end.
Students often ask why would they want to live on campus. The main points we have are convenience. Students also find a sense of community. Housing includes many of the housing costs, including utilities. We find that students have an improved satisfaction with the college and also have more opportunities for strong connections to faculty due to the proximity of being on campus where the faculty are during the day.
So there is lots of things happening for room selection for 2022. The biggest news is that One Tribe Place will close for the 2022-2023 academic year. That was included in the information that was shared out last week and also on our website. We completely understand that OTP is one of the most popular residence halls for students, but it is a temporary closure. It's only for a year and then it will be back online for fall of 2023. Again, if you have an SAS accommodation, we'll work with you directly through SAS office as we work through the room assignment process for medical accommodations. Richmond Hall will come back online. That's a traditional residence hall. That is for those of you who have not lived with us before. Richmond Hall was a residence hall for the last several years, except for last year, and then this year it's just not open. That will come back online next year. And then Giles and Page Halls, they will become first-year housing. And so if you currently live there, it would not be eligible for same room sign up for next year. And then Ludwell and Nicholas Apartments will remain open over winter break next year in line with Graduate Complex. That is new. And so that will be new for next year. So if you're wanting to live in a place that is going to remain open over winter break, these would be great locations for you to look at. Graduate Complex, also, if you are new to William & Mary this year, Graduate Complex houses all our grad students, but also there is a select building that has undergraduate students that live out there also. So then we also are in some ways introducing gender inclusive housing. This is actually replacing adaptive housing and flexible housing. So those two processes are going to retire and gender inclusive housing is going to take its place. We are really committed to offering gender inclusive housing options to ensure inclusive communities and just better options for students as they go through the housing selection process. And so when you go into the housing application for next year, you'll see when it goes live in January, you'll see that there's going to be two options. There's single gendered housing, which is having roommates, apartment mates, suite mates who are the same sex as listed in your banner. Gender inclusive housing is having roommates or suite mates, apartment mates of any gender or gender expression or identity. We're not going to ask for that information. We're just giving you the option for that living accommodation. It is a part of the general housing selection. And so what that means is that if you have said that you're going to be in gender inclusive housing, then those are the rooms that you're going to see. And we'll talk more about that later on in the presentation. There is potentially going to be a wait list if the demand for housing exceeds the supply of available spaces. We don't know if that will happen or not. We've not had a wait list for at least over 5 years, but we always put it out there just in case. But keep in mind that if you're social class 2025 or 2026, those social classes are required to live on campus per the 2-year live on. And so you would not be placed on the wait list or released from your contract because you're required to live on. So there is housing for those required students.
Who is eligible for on-campus housing? So you would have to be currently enrolled, a full-time undergraduate or graduate student for the spring of 2022 semester, or readmitted for the fall 2022 semester Um, if you are one of those things, you'll be able to apply for housing. If you have any questions about your readmission status, you'd have to go through the Dean of Students office since they coordinate all readmissions. If you're a spring study away student for spring 2022, you're also eligible. There is that 2-year residency requirement. So students in their freshman, sophomore years by social class are required to live on campus. So be sure, if you're a rising sophomore, be sure to go ahead and participate in the room selection process. That way you'll have more choice in where you're housed next year. If you don't select, we will for you.
So important dates to keep in mind in completing and submitting your housing contract. So the housing application is going to open in January. I believe January 31st is when that will open. This is a really important date to keep in mind though. You want to have your housing application and contract completed by Thursday, February 17th by 5 p.m. So students that have this, kind of how it will then kind of direct your next steps in the housing selection process. So if you have medical housing accommodations on file and who have submitted a housing application, sorry, words are hard today, a housing application by that February 17th deadline, you'll be assigned a housing medical accommodation selection day time slot, and that will guarantee you getting your accommodation that is on file. I do want to stress that that is based on the accommodation that you have on file at this time. So if you you already know now that you have an accommodation that needs to be changed, you'll want to start working with the SAS office for those accommodation needs. Or if you're a student that has no accommodations on file, but you know that you may need an accommodation for next year based on medical, then you'll want to start working with the SAS office now so that you have that accommodation on file by the time we get to February 17th, so that you can be added to the housing accommodation selection day and have that time slot guaranteeing your accommodations for next year. All other students who submit your 22-23 housing application and contract by the 17th deadline, you'll receive first chance of regular time slots based on social class during traditional room selection week. Students who submit their housing application and contract after the deadline, you'll be assigned a time slot at the end of your social class designated day based on traditional room selection. So if you miss that 5 p.m. on the 17th deadline, you're going to be on the last day of your social class at the end of the day. And so keep that in mind. If you get it in before, you're going to be at a better time slot. Students who submit their 22-23 housing application and contract after that 17th deadline. And if you don't do it before traditional room selection, you'll be assigned a different room selection day later on in the semester.
So consideration of the W&M Residence Life housing contract. So once it's submitted, the contracts are binding. So prior to occupancy, the contract must be signed and dated or electronically accepted as evidence of acceptance of the terms, conditions, and regulations stated in the contract. And at the time of signing a contract, if a student is not yet 18 years old, a parent or legal guardian of the student will be required to co-sign the contract. And just remember, failure to check in, pick up a key, or occupy an assigned space does not release the student from this contract. And failure to participate in a room selection, check in, pick up the key, or occupy the assigned space doesn't release the student from the contract.
So the period of contract is the entire academic year. So specifically fall and spring semesters and when classes and exams are in session. Unless we have, for whatever reason, terminated or suspended the terms and conditions of the contract. Unless there's a closure that we're unaware of, that is when it would end. So the period of contract will start from the moment that move-in begins, and then will end during finals week for the fall, and then reopening in January, and then closing again in May for spring semester. However, if you're in those locations that are approved to remain open over winter break, such as Graduate Complex, Ledwell, apartment spaces, then the period of contract is actually from August opening till May closing, and you have that winter break coverage.
So cancellation of the contract prior to occupancy. As we noted before, the university requires freshmen and sophomore bisocial class to live on campus unless this individual exception is granted. Students who are not required to live on campus have until February 28th from contract acceptance to cancel their contract with no penalty. After the 28th, students who have signed the housing contract for 22-23 academic year will owe and be charged full housing fees. Any termination of the housing contract subject to the terms listed there, it says sections 5, 6, and 7, may qualify the student for a refund or adjustment of room fees owed. If Residence Life is unable to provide a fall semester room assignment by August 1st of 2022, the student may request cancellation of the contract with no penalty. The cancellation contract, which I super want to stress, does not apply to freshman or sophomore bisocial class.
So after February 28th cancellation period and prior to May 31st. So this is for students that are not required to live on campus. Again, as Laura stated, if you're required to live on campus, you would not qualify for a cancellation fee. But if you're not required to live on, this is the schedule that you would follow. So prior to the 28th of February, there's no cancellation fee. But after the 28th, it becomes a $500 cancellation fee for the month of March. For the month of April, it becomes $1,000, and then for the month of May, it becomes $1,500. After the cancellation period ends on May 31st, you would seek for a contract release.
So I would like to let you folks know, in case you weren't aware, the contract cancellation process is separate from contract release process, and there are 2 separate pages in the application. So make sure you know which one you're requesting if you're requesting either, if you're requesting a cancellation or a contract release. So for a contract submitted after May 31st, within the first 10 days, there's a $500 cancellation fee. Between 11 and 20 days, there's a $1,000 cancellation fee. And then on or after the 21st day from contract submission, the student would have to request a contract release exemption, which is that separate process.
And I want to be clear that this contract submitted after May 31st, this is if you, for whatever reason, don't do a housing contract during the traditional room selection period, and decide after May that you want to live on campus, and you're putting your housing application in, this is the cancellation fee schedule that you would follow at that time. So going back to contract release exemptions, so this is again after May 31st. If you have decided you want to cancel a contract, but it's past May 31st, you would put in a contract released exemption request. Or if you are looking to live from home, which is within 30 miles of campus from your permanent address, you could submit a contract release exemption based on that. Students are able to submit a contract release request via the housing portal. It is a part of the housing application, like Laura talked about. It is a separate page. A release may be granted only to students able to demonstrate in writing and with supporting documentation of an unforeseen change in circumstances that can't be resolved in campus housing. Sometimes that is that a student is getting married, and so they need out of their housing contract, or they have a dependent, or they're living from home. We do request documentation even for the 30-mile living from home commute request. Those are typically the main ones. There is a financial request also, and again, documentation goes along with that too. And requests are considered on a case-by-case basis. Releases aren't guaranteed. Everything is reviewed by our office, and then we follow up with the students individually. Depending on what time of the year, students may receive a refund, and that is based on the withdrawal schedule and refunds by the university in the catalog.
So cancellation of housing contract during the 22-23 academic year by the resident student. So remember, a student who fails to occupy the assigned room is still obligated by the terms and conditions of the contract. The student may initiate cancellation of the contract because of withdrawal from the university. The contract will be terminated after the student has officially withdrawn from the university with appropriate written notification to Residence Life from Enrollment Support Services. And that student will have 48 hours to vacate their housing assignment. The student may receive a refund as outlined per the withdrawal schedule and refunds, which is the same as tuition, available in the undergraduate and graduate course catalogs. If the student withdraws from the university and re-enrolls during the same academic year, Residence Life reserves the right to reinstate the contract from the date of re-enrollment for the remainder of the academic year. The student who withdraws from the university prior to the end of the fall semester will not be subject to spring room fees charges as long as by the last day of fall semester classes, the student officially withdraws from the university and Residence Life receives confirmation from Enrollment Support Services in writing and subsequently completes residence hall checkout procedures by the last day of the fall semester. If a student leaves the university at the end of the fall semester after having completed requirements for graduation, the contract is terminated and the student will not be subject to spring housing fees. And if a student is authorized to leave campus to participate in one of the university's fall credit-bearing programs, such as domestic or study abroad programs, the student may request suspension of the housing contract in its entirety via the housing portal. The housing fees would be suspended for the duration of the off-campus program and then reinstated for the remainder of the academic year when the student is enrolled in an on-campus program. When participation in the off-campus program occurs during the fall semester, the student will be assigned a residence hall space for spring semester. If the student is authorized for an off-campus program for the spring semester, the student must notify Residence Life by the last day of the fall semester classes, and room fees will be suspended for the spring semester.
So not only is there a cancellation of housing contract by the student, but it can also be initiated by the university. So by the university, it's if the removal of student from the residence hall occurs as a result of a university disciplinary action or administrative withdrawal, you would not receive a refund based on that. So if we, as the university, are removing you from your contract, there is not a refund based on that. The university reserves the right to terminate the contract if the student fails to meet the university academic requirements. So if you're not enrolled in classes, again, we would withdraw you from your housing. And then based on the time of year, there may be a refund, but again, it's based on that course catalog. And so just keeping that in mind, you know, if you're not registered for classes and it's your first week back on campus, you're going to get emails from us that are going to say, hey, we noticed you're not registered for classes. This is what this means. The university reserves the right to terminate the contract if a student fails to maintain the full-time registration for a period of the contract. That is at the discretion of our associate vice president for campus living. The student may receive a refund again after you've vacated the space, but again, it's dependent on when you've left the space. Room adjustments, no adjustments in the charge for room fees will be made because of absence from the university for periods of time during the academic year, except as outlined above, based on the contract and the withdrawal schedule and refunds. Another potential cancellation that has happened, and we've learned this from going through COVID, the university may terminate this contract and a student's occupancy rights in the event of fire, earthquake, flood, hurricane, or other significant weather events or natural disasters, an act of God, strikes, work stoppages, or other labor disturbances, riots or civil commotions, litigation, or other act of any foreign nation, plague, epidemic, pandemic, power of government or governmental agency or authority, state of emergency, or any other causes, or in any cases mentioned above, whether natural or man-caused, which is beyond the control of the university. In the event of that, there is a refund schedule for fees based on that, depending on what point of the semester we are in. And you will see that in your contract even from this year, that depending on what time of the semester it is, that there is a outline of if we're in week 2, 3, or 4, this is the amount of housing that would be refunded back to your account. And so that is something to keep in mind in case something like that happens. We hope that this would not happen again, but it has.
So gender inclusive housing. Residence Life is committed to offering gender inclusive housing options to ensure inclusive communities. We offer 2 options for housing preferences based on gender. The first is single gendered housing, where you would have roommates, suite mates, apartment mates, all who have the same sex as listed in banner. And then also gender inclusive housing, where you would have roommates, suite mates, apartment mates of any gender or gender expression or identity. Very important, gender inclusive housing does not include single occupancy spaces. If you need a single occupancy space for medical needs related to gender identity or any other medical need, not just for a single, you should submit your request and related documentation to the Student Accessibility Services Office by the deadline listed on the accommodation selection page, which is February 7th. So you would need all the documentation, everything needed for your submission by February 7th. So important things to keep in mind about gender inclusive housing. Students selecting gender inclusive housing should plan to live with a roommate. You will not be able to search for a roommate who does not also have a selection of gender inclusive housing on their application. So this means if you've selected single gender housing, you'll not be able to search for roommates who have selected gender inclusive housing. So people who have selected single gender housing will only be able to see people of their same gender under the roommate group section. If they've selected gender inclusive housing, they will only see people who have also selected gender inclusive housing regardless of gender or sex. So Residence Life cannot guarantee that there will be enough options to grant all students gender inclusive housing preferences. In the event that Residence Life is unable to accommodate the request or the resident does not select a roommate, they'll be assigned a roommate based off of the single gendered housing preference. Gender inclusive housing is completely optional, and all students selecting the gender inclusive housing option must carefully read, accept, and understand the expectations listed. Gender inclusive housing is not intended for and is highly discouraged for romantic couples. However, students will not be asked for their reasoning for requesting gender inclusive housing. So gender inclusive housing eligibility. You must be at least 18 years of age at the time of the request. If you're not 18 yet, the system won't even ask you if you want gender inclusive housing because it's not an available option. Each individual student must be eligible for on-campus housing, and groups or living units cannot mix undergraduate or graduate students in the same unit, whether that's gender inclusive housing or single gendered housing. It's just not permitted. So for gender inclusive housing, we wanted to provide kind of a guideline of where students can anticipate that those locations would be. So for undergraduates, the groups of 2 would be in Hardy Hall, which would be very limited in number, but also in Ledwell Apartments in Richmond Hall. For groups of 3, there's a very limited number in Landrum Hall Attic, and then there are some Ledwell Apartments that hold 3 people. And then groups of 4 is the most likely, and that would be in Tribe Square in the graduate complex or any 4-person suite. And then housing for 6 would be in the Nicholas Apartments or the attic of Landrum Hall. There's triple suites up there. Also, students accepted into a living learning community, including Africana, Mosaic, Language Houses, or the CW House. And students with approved medical accommodations will also be eligible for gender inclusive housing. And then for graduate students, at the graduate complex, there's 2, 3, and 4 bedroom apartments there, and all of them would be eligible for gender inclusive housing.
So we also have special interest housing, and they do have separate timelines. So you want to make sure that you're paying attention to those because a lot of these have separate applications on top of the housing application. So a variety of special interest housing is available from Africana House that's located in Landrum Hall. We have Mosaic House that is located in Hardy Hall. We have the Colonial Williamsburg House, which is 2 students apply for the house and get to live there for the year and be our connection between Colonial Williamsburg and campus. And then we have the language houses, which are located in Landrum and Hardy Hall. And that is comprised of Arabic house, Chinese house, French house, German house, Hispanic house, the Italian house, the Japanese house, and then the Russian house. It depends on the year, but then they are located on different floors within Landrum and Hardy. So all of these different special interest housing options do have separate deadlines for submitting to live in those communities, which if you go to our website and you click on the special interest housing pages, it will take you to each one of these, and then you can see when their applications are due, if they have open houses occurring, if they're doing interview process and when those are happening. And so make sure that you go and check that out if that's something that interests you, and just take a look at that. Something that's not on here, if you're planning to live and you're in a fraternity or sorority, that is also another piece where you would go through your fraternity or sorority to be placed in your house, but you would still need to do a housing application.
So for accommodation housing, that is for medical accommodations for housing. The adaptive and flexible housing processes are being retired and replaced with the gender inclusive process that we talked about earlier. So those students with approved medical accommodation, those students with an approval for medical accommodation housing selection will select their rooms on February 23rd and 24th. So they're spread across 2 days. So for medical accommodations, the Student Accessibility Service Office, those requests only pertain to students who are requesting housing accommodations for the first time or are requesting changes to their current housing accommodation. So if you already have accommodations, you will have an accommodation time slot. But if you have new accommodations or you need revised accommodations, those are due February 7th. But please note, if you're a first-year student in a residence hall with a window unit, you will not be added to the accommodation room selection sign-up, as all upperclassmen halls have cooling systems. If you get your request into the SAS office after February 7th, we will continue to receive those as our office receives the approvals from Student Accessibility Services, but the actual room assignment that meets the accommodation will be considered after room selection. So there is likely to be a delay in implementing the accommodation based on space and availability. So we recommend that if you need that updated or new accommodation, you start that process now with Student Accessibility Services in the Dean of Students office.
Okay, so I know this is a big question and we get this a lot from sophomores. So we wanted to just be upfront, and we are upfront every year. Single rooms are rarely available for sophomores to select into during room selection process. Singles sometimes do become available during the academic year, and you can always submit a room change request at that time. But during the actual room selection process, most of our singles do go to students that have medical accommodations on file. And then if there are any singles that are still available during traditional room selection process, typically it goes to seniors and then juniors. And if anything is left by the time it gets to sophomores, it's really rare. So we just wanted to be upfront with that, but you can certainly put in a room change request over the summer to get on a room change short list if something were to open. And I would also keep in mind that the singles will be potentially more limited this coming year with the closure of OTP. And so keeping that in mind also. And that's why we really stress that if you know you need a single for a medical accommodation reason, that you need to make sure that that is on file if you don't have one currently on file with SAS and us.
So we're going to look a little bit at the timeline for online room selection. So this is found on the Residence Life website under housing. It does go over who goes first. Be sure to be prepared, especially if you're in a group that's unlikely to have singles available, be sure to find that roommate. But you'll see here, the housing application opens on January 31st at 9 o'clock. And then the deadline for submitting living learning community applications to the different programs is the 2nd of February. The deadline to submit new or revised medical accommodations to student accessibility services is February 7th. We are planning a roommate connect social on Sunday, February 13th. More information is pending there. And then we're also offering a gender inclusive social connect a couple days later. So big important day, Thursday, February 17th. That is the deadline by 5 p.m. to submit your housing application and contract. Be sure that if you have medical accommodations, that you have those on file and have submitted the housing contract by February 17th, so that we can get you that medical housing accommodation selection day time slot, guaranteeing your accommodation for the next year. As we covered before, there are the different groups. If you get your application and contract in on time, you have first chance for a regular time slot based on your social class during traditional selection. And it also lists what happens if you miss the deadline in both of those instances listed there. So on February 18th, we'll get that updated. Students will be emailed their time slot that evening if their contract was signed by 5 p.m. on February 17th. So all the other time slots will be emailed based on date of application. So on Monday, February 21st, we start first selection process happens. It's a living learning communities select that day. The next day is same room sign up. You would have to have requested same room sign up by 5 p.m. on the 17th of February. If you haven't requested it by then, it will not be available to you. Be sure with same room sign up that you are filling the entire unit. So if you're in a double with a hall bathroom, you have to fill both beds. If you're, say, in a DuPont suite, there's 2 people on each side of the bathroom, you have to fill all 4 spots to be able to use same room sign up. If you're in an apartment, you have to fill every bed in the apartment. So be sure that you have your roommate group set up and everything if you are requesting same room sign up. And also important for people with singles, if your single is available for next year for selection and you want to keep that single, be sure to sign up for same room sign up. Okay, so the next 2 days is medical housing accommodation selection. And after we're done with medical housing accommodation selection, if we find that we need to wait list, that's when we will email out at 5 p.m. that day, anybody who's waitlisted. And then on Friday is the day that fraternities and sorority group leaders will go in and assign their folks in their roommate groups. So the next week, we start on Monday, that's seniors and graduate students. This is traditional selection. So between 9 and 2:30 p.m., roommate groups can go in and fill available bed spaces. They do have to fill the entire unit. Between 3 and 4:30, students without a roommate can go in and select any available bed space. And then at 5 p.m., we close down room selection for the day so we can reset for the next day. And then on Tuesday is the Rising Juniors. It's also traditional selection following the same daily schedule as with seniors. And then on Wednesday is sophomore traditional selection following that same schedule. We will have a separate day for our St. Andrews students, and we will communicate that with them as the more information develops for their process. And then after online room selection ends, beginning in March, we started this last year. So all students who have submitted a housing application contract after their traditional selection day will get an opportunity, if we don't have a wait list, to select a space on the dates listed there. And then we open up the traditional room change request process on June 2nd.
Sorry, trying to get this to go all the way again. Okay, so let me see. Let me see if I can reset this. Hold on just a minute. Okay, for whatever reason, it did not want to reset back. So these are the next kind of steps. So completing and submitting your online housing contract. We can't stress those timelines. Again, it's going to go live January 31st that morning. It does not matter what time. And I want to stress this too, is that providing you put your housing application in between January 31st and February 17th, you will get a time slot for room selection. So you don't have to be online signing a contract during January 31st at 9 a.m. Like you can do it anytime between the 31st and the 17th because you'll get a time slot based on randomization. So it doesn't, I don't want you to stress out that you have to be there as soon as it opens on the 31st. You literally will have until the 17th by 5 p.m. Just make sure you have everything done, especially if you're looking at an interest housing or special interest housing or looking at an accommodation. Those are the pieces that you want to get done prior to the 17th. But your actual housing application does not need to be completed until the 17th. Again, any contract that's signed after 5 p.m. on the 17th, you'll then be assigned to a traditional room selection day based on your social class, but it will be at the end of the day. Whereas if you put it in prior to 5 p.m. on the 17th, depending on our system, like you could have the first time slot or the middle of the day, but it wouldn't be the last time slot. And so I want you to keep that in mind as you go through the process. So then prepare for selection. So there are so many factors that could play into this as you get ready for selection. We really encourage you to take time to consider your plans, including who your roommates are going to go, who your roommates are going to be. If you're looking at a single room, and keeping in mind that they're limited, like if you're dead set on getting a single, but then you get to room selection day and there's not a single available, what does that mean for you and your housing selection? Look at all your rooming options. Are you wanting to live in a double, a suite, an apartment style, and just kind of walk through like, what does that look like? Who are your roommates going to be? Do you want to go in with a random roommate? Do you want to go in with a group of friends? And just keeping that in mind. And keep in mind too, like based on the time slot, if there's a group of 4 of you and one of you has the best time slot, you want to go back in and make that person your group leader in your roommate group, because then they'll go in and assign the space during their time slot and assign your group at that time. Not all 4 of you would go in and assign. It'd be just the one group leader. So keep that in mind too in your planning and thinking about where you want to live. We also encourage you to have multiple plans. So let's say you go in and there's a group of 4 of you and there's no suites left or an apartment left, then do you split up into a group of 2, 2 and 2, and then select doubles based on that? And then keeping in mind, like, okay, if that happens in the moment, who's going to be in that room with you based on a double versus a suite? And so when we talk about making plans, we really want you to make plans and kind of think about all your potential options. We know everyone wants, their top choice, but sometimes that's not possibility based on space and availability. And we understand that. So just plan accordingly. And then again, just learning what to expect from online room selection and going to the website and just looking through all the different informational pieces. keeping in mind of that timeline and what that means for your process. If you're going through traditional room selection or you're going through a medical accommodation or special interest housing, and keeping that in mind, just be familiar with the processes, and also make sure that you're reading all the information that's coming to your email in regards to housing, because we don't want you to miss something. We will send reminder emails multiple times too of like, hey, room selection's coming up, room selection's here. We also will send you a reminder of like, reminder, here's your time slot. Don't forget to log in and choose your room. And even after it's opened, if we see that you've not assigned to a room, we kind of send a reminder of like, here's the next day that you can log in. And so keeping that in mind too.
So what if I'm applying to be an RA or want to live with one? So we advise that if students are unsure if they'll be a student staff member or if they'll be living with a student staff member, they should proceed through the room selection process as though they were neither. This way they can secure their preferred housing choice in case they're not hired or their friend's not hired. If a student is hired as an RA and leaves a vacancy in their old room, the roommate group will have through June 1st to add someone to the room selection rechanges dates. So they'll have the opportunity to fill that space with a preferred roommate. So some reminders, by signing and accepting the housing contract, you're committing to pay for on-campus housing for the full 2022-23 academic year. This means you commit before you know your specific room assignment. So please review the contract carefully, including the limited cancellation policies for those not required to live on campus. And as a reminder, this is a legally binding document.
So we know we have thrown a lot of information at you, but that now is a great time to ask questions, and know that if your question doesn't get answered or you think of something later on, you can always email myroom@wm.edu with questions, and we'll go ahead and respond to those too. Keep in mind, if you email a question between December 23rd and January 2nd, you most likely won't get a response from our office because we'll be closed for break. But any questions that come in over that time, we'll respond once the office reopens. And so we're going to walk through questions and try and answer as many as we can in the next couple of minutes.
We did have a question in the chat about the difference between a contract release or a cancellation. A cancellation is for folks who are rising juniors, rising seniors, graduate students. So for cancellation, that question comes after the contract and is subject to that fee schedule that we were talking about that's listed in the housing contract. Contract release is separate and comes before the contract page. And that's things for commuter releases, financial hardship, marriage, dependent, those sort of contract releases. You can actually review the ones that are currently available on the current housing application if you want to see the list.
So I can see that some people have posted the, if you submit your housing application immediately, do you get selection before people who do them later? Like I said in the presentation, it does not matter when you submit your housing application between January 31st and February 17th. That is not going to change your time slot outcome, because what happens is that we take all of those applications and then our system will generate you at random for your time slot. And so it's really important to figure out in your roommate group who has the best time slot for that person to go in and do the assignments based on that. And so it's randomized on each social class day.
So students who are going through the gender inclusive housing selection process, they do choose their own roommates in rooms. They should definitely have a roommate in their as part of their roommate group so that they can make that gender inclusive selection. It's very similar to how flexible housing worked in past years. Students also selected their own spaces through all of the processes.
So we, with the gender inclusive housing also, is that we set aside designated gender inclusive rooms and spaces. And that is going to be based on how many students apply for it during from that January 31st date to the February 17th date. That will kind of help us know how many spaces we would kind of put out there for gender inclusive housing. And then if they don't fill, then we would release them into the general housing selection process.
How do I ensure to get priority housing? The only way to ensure getting priority housing is to have an approved medical housing accommodation on file with the Student Accessibility Services Office. And if you need a new or revised accommodation through them, you would have to submit all of that documentation and request by February 7th. And you would have to fill out and accept the terms of the 22-23 housing application and contract by 5 p.m. on February 17th. By doing those things, you would be guaranteed to get that priority housing time slot.
So the next question is, does selecting gender inclusive housing mean you can't room with people assigned the same sex at birth as you? If you opt in gender inclusive housing, it means that you can live with basically whoever. If you opt for single gendered housing, it would be the same sex that is showing on your banner, and that would match the student's banner. Gender inclusive housing is for students that are maybe non-binary or identify differently, but that it's based on what you choose and what your potential roommates choose.
So somebody asked, if you lived in Tribe Square, are you charged for 3 semesters or only for 2 semesters? So as you'll notice in the current contract, it is for 3 semesters. That includes, so this year it was summer of 2021, fall of 2021, and spring of 2022. And students are charged separately for all 3 semesters. And those bills are due at the same time as tuition.
So we have if you're a transfer student for 2022, does waitlisting happen often for spring transfers? We have not had a waitlist in over 5 years, and so that would be hard to answer. There are groups of students that are kind of in a way protected from the waitlist, and so the other piece too is if you ever do get waitlisted, you'll never get waitlisted again in a housing selection process, but we won't know what that looks like until we get into the process. We may not have a waitlist at all. It just depends on how many applications come in at the time. But if you're a social class of, again, 2025 or 2026, you would not get waitlisted because you're required to live on. And so you wouldn't have to worry about that.
Somebody else asked, can people select gender inclusive housing as a roommate group? You would need to select it as a roommate group. So every student will go in their application, they'll get to the gender inclusive housing page, and if they say yes, they'll proceed through the process to the roommate group page specifically for gender inclusive housing. And that's where they're joined together in a roommate group. And then when the person with the best time slot that they have made the roommate group leaders time slot opens, they would select for the group.
We have a question about mattresses. I'm not sure what this question means because every room that you move into has a mattress in place. Depending on the location, it would be a full mattress or an extra long twin, depending on the space. So I'm not quite sure what that question means. If it's an accommodation question, that might be something that you would work through our office and the SAS office.
So somebody asked about withdrawal exemption for spring semester and they're leaving tomorrow. Do a self-checkout form the day that you leave. That would be fantastic. And be sure to return your key.
But if you're coming back to live with us this spring, you can take your key home with you and make sure you bring it back. Are there other questions that we can answer now about room selection and it coming up? Again, you have time to email us with questions, or if you think about something over break, know that you'll be able to come email our myroom@wm.edu account. That's probably the best way to get your questions answered. We're going to have the roommate connect. So if you right now know you want to have roommates, but you don't have roommates potentially yet, we'll have that roommate connect in February. And then we'll also have a gender inclusive roommate kind of social connect, just to try and really help students connect with others that may want to live together next year. I will say that sometimes having roommates is helpful, because then you may get into a space that you more prefer over going in at random, because it is a different time of the day that you're doing room selection. So just keep that in mind.
So on the room selection process, we do have step-by-step guides about how to go through the process. Since we've had some updates, we will be updating those guides before room selection actually starts. So if anybody has any end of fall self-checkout questions, please email myroom@wm.edu. We'd be glad to assist you there. Everybody does have to do a self-checkout whether they're coming back or not.
So if there are no more questions for the 22-23 housing selection at this time, we're going to go ahead and kind of end the session. We will post this online probably when we come back in January. Hopefully it will be on the website at that point, but we do intend to upload it there. And again, I want to stress, if you have questions, email myroom@wm.edu, because we are going to respond to you there. We are already getting a ton of questions every day about it, and so we are happy to answer. And so just keep that in mind. I know that more questions come up the closer we get to the room selection process itself. And again, I want to stress, have multiple plans in case your top choice is not available at the time you go into room selection, and just keep that in mind. Laura, anything else you want to add?
No, we're just looking forward to going through the process and helping folks get their new spaces for next year.
And we hope that you all have a great winter break, and we'll see you all back in the spring.
Thank you.